Hello, Father Sebastian.
Hi.
Good to see you.
Thank you. Good to see you.
This is Father Sebastian. He is the most eloquent person that I know. He's precise. He likes to define words before he speaks. And so I chose him for this interview for his clarity. And so, Father Sebastian, if you'd like to tell us who you are and what would you like people that are watching this video to know about you?
Okay, well, first of all, I'm an Norbertine priest from here, the Abbey of St. Michael's in California, and I've been a priest here for almost 15 years. I originally grew up in Pasadena. My background, once upon a time, I used to be an electrical engineer and worked in the intellectual property field for a while, and intellectual property law. And then I found my true love in philosophy, and I went off to study philosophy, and I think that's my penchant for defining, came from my studies of philosophy in particular. And eventually I found my way here to the Abbey, and so thanks be to God, I have a very happy, beautiful life. My life is dedicated to the worship of God and the help and love of my neighbor. So I've got a pretty good idea that those things are really important for human happiness and flourishing. So.
Thank you. Now, what I want to talk about is how hard it is to be a leader in this time. So in my opinion, the leaders were faced with a very difficult decision because there were two negatives. One thing that they could do is just lock everything down to save the lives of the older people and the people that are sick. Mm-hmm. But this decision results in the destruction of the economy, 30 million jobs lost, and a lot of debt. So we added $2 trillion of debt in the last 2 months. Mm-hmm. And the other thing they could have said is just let the life go on as it normally would. Mm-hmm. Have the people that are older and sicker stay inside and protect mm-hmm. themselves. But this probably would have resulted in more deaths mm-hmm. than we actually have. So what should a leader do when they're faced with a decision that results?
A no-win situation,
exactly.
Yeah.
This was a no-win situation. You are blamed no matter what you do. Somebody
That's right.
will be unhappy.
Yeah.
So,
well, St. Thomas Aquinas points out that the principal virtue that's necessary for leadership is a virtue called prudence. And prudence is the ability by which you're able to direct yourself and others to their ultimate good, which is happiness. So if you're prudent, you're able to see the right means that get you to happiness in the best way, even when you're faced with a dilemma that seems to have no good outcome. And prudence was really necessary here. Early on, it was probably prudent to institute some kind of restrictions, even economic restrictions and so forth, because they didn't know exactly how dangerous the disease was. If they in fact found out it would kill likely 5 to 10% of the population, including young people and everything, then obviously that danger would have outweighed the economic problems that could have come from the economic quarantines and so forth. But later on, they found pretty quickly, in fact, that the disease was not deadly for young people, and that at most you might have something like 0.5% of the population might die from it, even if you just let it spread without anyone doing any intervention or anything like that. So that required a new calculation of prudence, a new consideration of things, And I think that some countries did a better job than we did with regard to balancing the goods of human life. And I think the proper response ought to have been, once we got all the information that we needed, the proper response would have been, first of all, to allow young people to be at work, to interact with one another, allow humans' natural defense mechanism and immune system to build up an immunity to this, so that to let nature fight nature. Nature has given us or equipped us with all sorts of wonderful abilities, and given that this disease was extremely unlikely to cause death for a young person. In fact, you're much more likely, for example, to die, driving your car or something like that, than to die from this disease if you're, say, under 50 years old or under 60 years old. Given that was the case, I think it would have been prudent let young people be in schools, yet let young people be at work, let them interact in normal businesses, let the businesses be open. And then have very strong recommendations for people who have health problems, what are called comorbidities, and who are over 65, which is the threshold when the disease started to become more likely to cause death in a significant way. Have those people self-quarantine. And then you have to leave it, we're a free country, and you have to leave it to the decisions and prudence of each individual. Now, there's one exception to that, in my opinion. That one exception is when you have elderly people who are so fragile that they're incapable of caring for themselves, they need someone else to care for them. And in cases like that, I think there should have been laws protecting those people so that those who care for them were also not exposed to the disease, so that those helpless elderly people would not necessarily be exposed to the virus. So I do think there's some room for prudence there. I don't think it should have been simply elderly and sick people self-quarantine, everyone else do your thing. I think there should have been room for those who are going to be caretakers for those who are very fragile and unable to care for themselves. They have a responsibility for the sake of those people to isolate themselves as well, or to somehow prevent themselves from getting that disease. So that's how I think it should have been done. It turns out that there are a number of countries, I think Sweden was one of them, that decided they were not going to go with an economic lockdown. And it turns out the number of deaths is comparable to what we have in the United States, in fact, a little bit less. And therefore, it shows that the many severe economic measures that we took in the United States did not have the effect of reducing deaths the way they thought it would, number one. And number two, what ended up happening as collateral damage is, apart from the economic damage, people suffer from depression. There was a much higher rate of suicides. There was a very high rate of people who died from other things, but they didn't go to the hospital to get treated because they were afraid of getting COVID-19, right? Instead of just going in and getting their normal medical care and things such as that. And then other things besides, other harms besides. So it may have been that more lives were lost from the shutdown than there were from the disease itself. That'd be an interesting study for someone to undertake. I've been told that they've assembled a study like that, and it turns out the number of deaths that came as a result of the economic lockdown actually exceeded the number of deaths that came as a result of the disease.
This is something that I heard, that in the northern part of California, they have more deaths from suicides than they have from the virus.
From the virus, yeah. So yeah, it's a real problem. Mental health is a real issue, and if you prevent people from the personal relationships that they need, then it's going to be disastrous for people's mental